Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, a place where gentle stories, quiet narration, and unhurried atmospheres help you settle into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I would love to know where you are listening from this evening. If you feel inclined, leave a word in the comments below. It is always a quiet pleasure to see how far our small gathering reaches across the world. Now, let us take a moment together before the story begins. Find a comfortable position wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Unclench your jaw if it has tightened during the day. Let your hands fall open and rest wherever feels most natural. Take a slow breath in. Hold it gently for a moment, and then release it, letting the air carry with it whatever weight the hours have placed upon you. There is nothing you need to remember right now. There is nothing you need to solve. The morning will keep its questions for the morning. Tonight belongs only to stillness. Allow your eyes to close, or let them soften until the room around you becomes a blur of familiar shapes. My voice will be here, steady and unhurried. And all you need to do is listen, or not listen, or drift somewhere in between. Either way, you are exactly where you should be. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let the day fold itself away like a letter you have already read. And when you are ready, we will step together into a small, warm room in London a long time ago, where a man is finishing the last careful lines of his evening's work. It was a Tuesday in late November of 1891, and the light had begun to fail along Fleet Street well before the clocks marked 5. The afternoons at that time of year had a way of contracting without warning, the pale gray sky pulling itself downward like a curtain lowered too soon, so that by 1:30 the gas lamps along the pavement were already doing their patient duty, each one casting a small circle of amber warmth against the encroaching dusk. The air held the particular dampness of a London autumn, not yet bitter, but cool enough that a man stepping outside without his coat would feel the chill settle against his collar within a dozen paces. There was rain in it, too, though it had not yet declared itself. The clouds were low and full, pressing upon the rooftops as if they meant to rest there a while before deciding what to do. Off the main thoroughfare, down a narrow turning where the buildings leaned slightly toward one another as old acquaintances might over a fence, there stood a modest premises whose ground floor window bore, in small gilt lettering now somewhat faded, the words Hargrove and Son, engravers. The shop was not large, nor was it positioned to attract passing custom. It did not need to be. Its reputation had been built across 3 decades of careful, unhurried work, and the clients who required its services knew precisely where to find it. The window displayed nothing at all, save a drawn curtain of dark green baize and, resting upon the sill behind it, a single copper plate mounted in a small wooden frame, its surface catching what little light remained in the street and returning it in a dull, coppery gleam. Inside, the studio occupied a single room of perhaps 12 feet by 16, with a ceiling that was neither high nor particularly low, but of that comfortable middle height that makes a room feel contained without feeling cramped. The walls had been painted some years ago in a shade of deep cream that had since mellowed to the color of old parchment. Along the left-hand wall, a set of wooden shelves held orderly rows of copper plates in various stages of completion, each one standing upright in its own narrow slot, separated from its neighbors by thin strips of felt. On the opposite wall, above a low cabinet, hung a series of framed prints, proofs pulled from the studio's own plates over the years, bookplates and decorative panels, and small reproductions of architectural details, each one exhibiting the precise, clean line work that was the hallmark of the establishment. The room was heated by a small coal fire set into an iron grate at the far end, and above the mantelpiece there rested a plain clock with a white face and Roman numerals, its steady, unhurried ticking the most consistent sound in the room. The fire had been banked some time earlier in the afternoon, so that it now burned low and even, giving off a warmth that was felt most clearly within a few feet of the grate, but that gently touched the whole of the space with a background heat that kept the November chill at bay. The coals glowed with a deep orange light, settling occasionally with a soft click as one piece shifted against another, and the faintest thread of smoke rose from the grate and disappeared into the flue without troubling the air of the room. At the center of the studio, positioned to receive the best of the remaining daylight from the window, and supplemented now by the steady glow of a gas lamp mounted on an adjustable brass arm, there stood the workbench. It was a broad, solid piece of furniture, its surface of thick oak worn smooth by years of use, darkened in places where ink had soaked into the grain and would not be coaxed out again. Upon it, arranged with the kind of order that comes not from fussiness but from long habit, lay the tools and materials of the engraver's trade. A leather-covered sandbag, about the size of a man's head, sat in the center of the bench, and upon it rested the copper plate that was the evening's principal concern. To the right of the sandbag, in a shallow wooden tray lined with felt, a row of Burins stood upright in their slots, their mushroom-shaped handles of polished boxwood catching the lamplight, their steel shafts angled and glinting where the cutting faces had been honed to a fine edge upon the oilstone that sat nearby. There were 6 of them in the tray, graded from the broadest square-faced tool to the finest lozenge-pointed instrument, and each one was positioned so that its handle faced outward, ready to be taken up without hesitation. Beside the tray of Burins, a small pot of black printing ink stood with its lid set loosely in place. A folded square of clean muslin lay beside it, and next to that a scraper with a flat, triangular blade used for removing the fine curls of copper that the Burin threw up on either side of each incised line. A magnifying glass on a jointed brass stand was pulled close to the edge of the sandbag, its lens angled so that it hovered just above the surface of the plate, and through it the finest details of the engraved design could be examined without strain. The whole arrangement spoke of a man who had spent a great many years at this bench and had long since settled upon the precise position of every object, so that each tool could be reached and returned without thought, the way a musician's fingers find the keys of a familiar instrument. The man himself sat upon a high stool, his back straight but not rigid, his shoulders settled in the posture of one who has learned that tension is the enemy of fine work. He was perhaps 55 years of age, though the lamplight was kind to him and smoothed the deeper lines of his face into softer suggestions. His hair, once dark, had turned to a steel gray at the temples and was combed back from a broad forehead with no particular vanity. He wore a plain waistcoat of dark wool over a white shirt whose sleeves had been rolled to the elbow and secured with a pair of simple bands, revealing forearms that were sinewy and speckled with the tiny silver scars that copper engravers acquire over a lifetime of work, where a Burin has slipped or a sharp edge of metal has caught the skin. His hands were steady, the fingers long and somewhat thickened at the tips from years of gripping the Burin handle against the resistance of the plate. His name was Arthur Hargrove, and he was the son in the gilt lettering upon the window, though his father had been dead these 12 years and Arthur had carried the business alone since then. He had been apprenticed to the trade at 14, learning first from his father and then spending 3 years in the workshop of a silver-plate engraver in Clerkenwell before returning to Fleet Street to take his place at the family bench. He had never married, not from any aversion to the idea, but simply because the years had moved past him with a quiet insistence while he was occupied with his plates and his Burins. And by the time he looked up from his work and considered the matter, he found that he was content enough with his solitude and saw no pressing reason to disturb it. This evening, as on many evenings, he was alone in the studio, and the quality of the silence around him was of the kind that settles when a room has been occupied by a single person for a long while. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of concentration, a living quiet that held within it the faint sounds of breathing, the occasional creak of the stool as he shifted his weight, the barely audible whisper of steel moving through copper, and beneath it all the steady, companionable ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. The plate before him was a bookplate, an ex libris design commissioned by a gentleman whose library occupied the better part of a house in Bloomsbury. It was a decorative piece in the manner that had lately become fashionable, owing something to the influence of the arts and crafts movement that had been making itself felt in the world of printed ornament. The design featured a central cartouche bearing the owner's name and the words ex libris in a restrained italic hand, surrounded by an elaborate border of intertwined ivy leaves and small, precisely rendered acorns. At the top of the composition, a pair of open books rested upon a ribbon that curled gently at each end, and at the base, a motto in Latin ran along a narrow scroll. The whole design occupied a space no larger than 3 inches by 4, and yet within that modest area there were several hundred individual lines, each one cut by hand into the copper with the Burin, each one requiring a particular depth and width and curvature to achieve the desired effect when the plate was eventually inked and pressed against paper. Arthur had been working on this plate for the better part of 3 weeks, and it was now very nearly complete. The central lettering had been finished some days ago, and the border had occupied him through the previous week. What remained was the final detailing of the ivy leaves in the lower right corner of the design, a section that required the finest of his lozenge-pointed Burins and a particularly light and controlled hand, for the leaves here overlapped one another in a way that demanded careful attention to the relative depth of each line, so that when printed, the foreground leaves would appear darker and more defined than those behind them, creating an illusion of depth upon the flat surface of the paper. He leaned forward now, bringing his eye close to the magnifying glass, and examined the section he had been working on for the past hour. The lamplight, directed by the brass arm so that it fell upon the plate at a low angle, threw each incised line into sharp relief, the tiny channels in the copper appearing as dark threads against the polished surface. He could see the individual leaves taking shape beneath his Burin, each one composed of a central vein from which smaller lines branched outward in gentle curves, tapering to fine points at the leaf's edge. The spaces between the veins had been filled with closely spaced parallel lines, hatching that would hold the ink and print as a soft tone, suggesting the flat surface of the leaf between its raised veins. He was satisfied with what he saw. The lines were clean and even, without the slight wavering that could betray a tired hand or a moment of lost concentration. The curves of the leaf edges were smooth and continuous, each one following the natural form of an ivy leaf with an accuracy that came not from copying a specimen pinned to the bench, though he had done that in his earlier years, but from a knowledge of the plant so thorough that his hand could reproduce its shapes as easily as it could write his own name. He picked up the finest Burin from the tray, a tool whose lozenge-shaped cutting face was scarcely wider than the tip of a sewing needle. The boxwood handle settled into his palm with the familiarity of an old handshake. He positioned his thumb and forefinger along the steel shaft, just behind the cutting point, and brought the tool to the plate at the shallow angle that 30 years of practice had made second nature. The sandbag beneath the plate gave slightly under the pressure of his hand, allowing him to rotate the plate fractionally as he worked, turning it to meet the Burin rather than forcing the tool to follow a curve. This was the essential technique of copper engraving, the quiet collaboration between hand and plate, the steady push of the Burin through the soft metal, while the other hand guided the plate upon its cushion, the two movements combining to produce a line that could turn and taper and swell with a fluency that no mechanical process could replicate. He began to cut. The Burin entered the copper with a faint, almost inaudible sound, a tiny whisper of metal parting beneath the blade. A thin curl of copper, fine as a hair, rose ahead of the cutting point and coiled upon the surface of the plate. He worked slowly, drawing the line in a gentle arc that followed the contour of a leaf's edge, controlling the depth of the cut by the angle at which he held the tool and the pressure he applied through his forefinger. The line began thin, swelled slightly as it followed the broadest part of the curve, and then tapered again as it approached the point where it would meet another line already cut. The entire stroke took perhaps 4 seconds, and when it was complete, he lifted the Burin, set it down, and reached for the scraper. With a single light pass of the scraper's blade, he removed the tiny burr of copper that the Burin had raised along the edges of the new line. The scraper made a soft, rasping sound as it crossed the surface, and the curl of metal fell away onto the bench, where it lay among a small scattering of others, glinting like miniature springs in the lamplight. He blew gently across the plate to clear any remaining fragments, then brought his eye to the magnifying glass once more. The new line was good. It joined its neighbors cleanly, without any visible hesitation at the junction. He allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction, a gesture so slight that no one but himself would have noticed it, and then he repositioned the plate upon the sandbag and brought the Burin to bear once more. This was the rhythm of his evenings, and it was a rhythm as regular and as soothing as the ticking of the clock or the soft settling of the coals. Cut, scrape, examine, reposition. Cut, scrape, examine, reposition. Each cycle added one more line to the design, one more tiny channel in the copper that would, when the plate was complete, hold its portion of ink and transfer its mark to the paper. The accumulation was gradual and almost imperceptible, like the growth of frost upon a window pane, so that the design seemed not so much to be created as to be slowly revealed, emerging from the blank copper as if it had been there all along, waiting for the Burin to uncover it. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived. It came not with any dramatic announcement, but with a quiet, steady pattering against the window panes, so gentle that Arthur did not notice it immediately. When he did become aware of it, pausing between one line and the next to stretch his fingers and roll his shoulders, it had already settled into a constant, even rhythm that blended with the other quiet sounds of the room. The clock, the fire, the occasional creak of the building's old timbers adjusting to the damp. The rain ran down the glass in thin, meandering streams, distorting the glow of the gas lamp in the street outside into soft, shifting shapes of amber and gold. The sound of it was neither intrusive nor unwelcome. It enclosed the studio in an additional layer of quiet, separating the warm interior from the wet street with a curtain of water and sound that made the room feel more self-contained, more removed from the world beyond its walls. He returned to his work. The lower right section of the border was progressing well, and he estimated that another hour of steady engraving would see it complete. There was no urgency in this estimation. The plate was not due to be delivered for another 10 days, and even if it had been needed sooner, Arthur was not a man who could be hurried. His father had taught him early that haste was incompatible with quality in this trade, that a line cut too quickly would betray its speed in a subtle unevenness that the eye might not consciously detect, but that would nonetheless diminish the overall impression of the finished print. Work at the pace the copper asks for, the elder Hargrove had been fond of saying, and the copper will reward you. It was advice that Arthur had taken to heart and had never found reason to question. The gas lamp on its brass arm hummed faintly, a low, almost subliminal note that was more felt than heard. Its light was steady and warm, casting a clearly defined pool of illumination upon the workbench, while leaving the rest of the room in a softer, more diffuse glow. The shadows in the corners of the studio were deep but not dark, filled with the reflected warmth of the firelight and the gentle amber of the gas. It was a room that seemed, at this hour, to exist in a space slightly apart from the ordinary passage of time, a small enclosure of warmth and light and quiet industry, sealed against the November evening by its curtained window and its heavy door and the steady sound of rain. Arthur completed another leaf, a small one that lay partially behind its larger neighbor, its lines cut with a slightly lighter touch to suggest its receding position within the design. He set down the Burin and flexed his right hand, spreading the fingers wide, and then curling them slowly into a fist and releasing them again, a habit that kept the tendons supple and prevented the cramping that was an occupational hazard of his trade. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 20 minutes past 6. He had been at the bench since 2:30, with only a brief pause at 4 o'clock to make a cup of tea on the small spirit stove that stood on the cabinet beneath the framed prints. He rose from his stool now, moving carefully, for his back had stiffened slightly during the long period of sitting, and crossed to the fire. The coals had burned down to a glowing bed of embers, and he took the small brass shovel from its hook beside the grate and added 3 pieces of coal from the scuttle, placing each one deliberately so that it rested upon the embers without smothering them. The new coal would take a few minutes to catch, and in the meantime the fire continued to radiate its stored warmth into the room. He stood before it for a moment, his hands held out toward the glow, feeling the gentle heat ease the slight ache in his fingers that came from gripping the Burin for so many hours. The rain continued its quiet conversation with the window. From somewhere in the street, muffled by the walls and the drawn curtain, came the faint sound of footsteps passing, the quick, purposeful tread of someone hurrying through the wet evening toward home or tavern. A horse and cab rattled past on the cobbles of Fleet Street, the sound reaching the studio as a distant rumble and then fading until it was swallowed by the rain. These sounds came and went like visitors who glanced in through the window but did not stop, and Arthur paid them no particular attention. They were simply part of the fabric of the evening, as familiar and unremarkable as the pattern of the wallpaper in a room one has occupied for 30 years. He returned to the bench, settled himself upon the stool, and adjusted the lamp so that its light fell precisely where he needed it. Before resuming his work, he took the folded square of muslin and, with a gentle, circular motion, wiped the surface of the plate, removing the fine dust of copper particles that had accumulated during the past hour of cutting. The muslin came away faintly discolored, bearing the merest trace of copper upon its white surface, and he refolded it to present a clean face and set it down beside the ink pot. He examined the plate once more through the magnifying glass, turning it slowly upon the sandbag to bring each section of the border into view. The ivy leaves in the upper portions of the design, completed earlier in the week, were crisp and assured, their lines confident and properly graduated. The acorns, each one no larger than a grain of rice upon the actual plate, were rendered with a miniaturist precision, their caps cross-hatched in fine lines that would print as a convincing texture. The central cartouche, with its careful lettering, sat cleanly within its decorative frame. Only the lower right corner remained unfinished, and even there the gaps were narrowing with each session of work. He picked up the Burin again. The boxwood handle was warm from his grip, and the steel shaft had taken on the temperature of the room, so that it no longer felt cold against his fingers as it had when he first took it up hours earlier. He positioned the plate, brought the cutting point to the copper, and began once more the slow, precise work of incising the next line. The fresh coal on the fire caught with a soft pop, and a small tongue of blue flame licked around its edges before settling into a steady, quiet burn. The clock ticked. The rain fell. The Burin moved through the copper. And the room held all of these sounds together in a gentle equilibrium, each one contributing to a quietness that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a particular kind of peace. He thought, briefly and without any particular intensity, of the man who had commissioned the bookplate. Mr. Edward Lacey was a collector of some considerable devotion, a solicitor by profession, but a bibliophile by temperament, who had spent the better part of 2 decades assembling a library that now occupied 3 rooms of his house in Bloomsbury. Arthur had met him only twice, once when the commission was first discussed, and once more when Mr. Lacey had called to the studio to approve the preliminary drawing. He was a quiet, precise man, not unlike Arthur himself in certain respects, and their conversations had been conducted in the manner of 2 people who understood each other's trades well enough to dispense with unnecessary explanation. Mr. Lacey had described what he wanted, a design that reflected his interest in natural history and his affection for the classical tradition. And Arthur had listened and asked a few questions and then produced, within a week, a pencil drawing that Mr. Lacey had approved with a brief nod and the single word satisfactory, which Arthur understood to be high praise from a man of such measured vocabulary. The relationship between an engraver and his client was, in Arthur's experience, a straightforward one. The client described the design. The engraver executed it. Between these 2 points lay a great deal of skilled labor and patient craftsmanship, but the essential transaction was simple. Arthur did not consider himself an artist, though others might have used the word. He was a tradesman, a maker of useful and beautiful objects, and his satisfaction lay not in the expression of personal feeling, but in the faithful execution of a design to the highest possible standard. If the finished plate was clean and accurate and produced a print that pleased the eye, then the work was well done. If it fell short in any respect, the fault was his alone and must be corrected before the plate left his hands. This was the ethic that his father had instilled in him, and it had served him well through 3 decades of quiet, steady practice. The thought of his father passed through his mind like the shadow of a cloud crossing a sunlit field. The elder Hargrove had occupied this same bench, sat upon this same stool, and used some of these same tools, for the Burins were of a quality that outlasted their owners, and several of those in the tray had been purchased by his father and sharpened and resharpened over decades of use until their steel shafts were visibly shorter than they had been when new. The oil stone, too, was his father's, its surface worn into a gentle concavity by years of honing. These objects were not sentimental keepsakes. They were working tools, and they continued to serve their purpose with undiminished effectiveness. But their presence in the studio was a kind of continuity that Arthur valued without examining too closely, a thread that connected his work to the work that had come before, and that gave the room a sense of depth and accumulation that went beyond the mere passage of time. He did not dwell upon these thoughts. They arose and subsided of their own accord, carried along on the current of the evening's quietness, no more demanding of attention than the sound of the rain or the glow of the coals. His mind, released from the close focus of engraving, moved gently from one thing to another, lighting upon each only briefly before moving on. He thought of the proof he would pull when the plate was finished, the moment when the dampened paper was lifted from the copper and the design appeared for the first time in its intended orientation. The leaves and the lettering and the scroll work all reversed from their engraved form into their printed one. That moment was always a small pleasure, not dramatic or revelatory, but satisfying in the way that any confirmation of careful work is satisfying, a quiet affirmation that the hand had done what the mind intended. He thought, too, of the other plates on the shelves, the commissions awaiting his attention in the weeks ahead. There was a set of decorative panels for a publisher in Paternoster Row, ornamental borders intended for the title pages of a limited edition of verse. There was a trade card for a silversmith on Cheapside, a small but exacting piece of work that required the reproduction of the silversmith's mark in minute detail. And there was a memorial plate, commissioned by the family of a recently deceased clergyman, which would require a degree of sobriety and restraint in its design that presented its own particular challenge. Each of these commissions would come to the bench in its turn, and each would receive the same patient, meticulous attention that the current bookplate was receiving. There was no hierarchy of importance in Arthur's work. A trade card and a memorial plate and a bookplate were all, to him, occasions for the exercise of his craft, and each deserved the best he could give. But these were tomorrow's concerns, and they settled back into the quiet waters of his mind without causing any disturbance. The evening had reached that particular hour when the boundary between work and rest becomes indistinct, when the body has begun to release the tension of the day, but the mind has not yet fully surrendered its engagement. It was a liminal time, neither fully active nor fully at ease, and Arthur inhabited it with the naturalness of man who had spent many thousands of evenings in precisely this state, sitting in this room, watching this fire, listening to this rain. The warmth of the coals reached him where he sat, and he could feel it softening the muscles of his shoulders and his back, easing the tightness that the hours of concentrated work had built up along his spine. His hands, resting upon his knees, were still now, the fingers relaxed and slightly curled, and he could feel in them the residual sensation of the Burin, a faint tingling in the fingertips where the vibration of the cutting tool had been transmitted through the steel shaft and the boxwood handle into his flesh. This sensation would fade within the hour, as it always did, and by the time he climbed the stairs to his rooms, his hands would feel entirely his own again, free of the tool's memory. The clock measured out its steady intervals. A coal settled in the grate with a sound like a whispered syllable. The rain, if anything, had grown softer, its tapping upon the glass lighter and more intermittent, as if the clouds were beginning to exhaust their store and the evening was easing toward a drier, stiller night. Through the curtained window, the glow of the gas lamps along the street entered the room as a faint, diffused warmth of color, barely perceptible against the stronger light of the fire, but present nonetheless, a reminder that the world outside continued its quiet existence even as the studio withdrew into its own private stillness. Arthur became aware, in the way that one becomes aware of something that has been present for some time without being noticed, that the building had grown very quiet. During the working hours, even in this relatively secluded side street, there were sounds that penetrated the walls, the muffled voices of people passing, the rattle of wheels on cobbles, the distant chiming of church bells marking the quarters. But now, at this late hour and in this weather, the street had emptied, and the sounds that reached him were few and far between. A footstep, distant and solitary, passing quickly, the creak of a sign swinging on its bracket somewhere down the turning. And then nothing, only the rain and the fire and the clock and the slow, even rhythm of his own breathing, which had settled into a pace so unhurried that each breath seemed to last a very long time, the air moving in and out of his lungs with a deliberateness that matched the pace of the evening itself. This quietness was not something Arthur sought or cultivated. It was simply the natural condition of his evenings, as much a part of his life as the work that preceded it and the sleep that would follow. He was not a lonely man, though he lived alone. He had acquaintances in the trade, fellow engravers and printers and booksellers with whom he exchanged greetings when their paths crossed, and he dined occasionally with a cousin who lived in Islington. But his deepest companionship was with his work and with this room, and the hours he spent here in the quiet of the evening were, without his ever having articulated it to himself, the hours he valued most. The fire shifted once more, a coal tilting forward with a soft grinding sound and settling into a new position. A brief shower of sparks rose from the contact and disappeared into the dark throat of the flue. The light in the room flickered momentarily and then steadied, and the shadows in the corners swayed once and were still. Arthur watched this small event with the same calm, unhurried attention with which he watched everything in these hours, noting it without interpreting it, receiving it as simply one more thread in the fabric of the evening. There is a particular quality to the work of engraving that distinguishes it from most other forms of craft. In carpentry or masonry, the material resists the tool, and the worker must exert force to shape it. In painting, the medium yields almost too readily, and the challenge lies in restraint. But copper, worked with the Burin, occupies a middle ground. It is soft enough to be cut cleanly, without the brute effort that stone or hardwood demands, yet firm enough that each line must be deliberately placed, each curve consciously guided. The metal does not forgive carelessness. A line cut too deeply cannot be made shallower. A curve that strays from its intended path cannot be straightened. Every mark upon the plate is permanent, and this permanence imposes upon the engraver a discipline of attention that, over the course of many years, becomes indistinguishable from a kind of meditation. Arthur had long since ceased to think of his work in such terms. He did not consider himself a contemplative man, and if someone had suggested to him that his evenings at the bench were a form of meditative practice, he would have looked at them with the mild bewilderment of someone who has been told that the act of walking is a philosophical enterprise. He simply engraved. He had always engraved. The Burin was as natural to his hand as a pen is to a clerk's, and the act of cutting lines into copper was so deeply embedded in the fabric of his daily life that it required no more conscious reflection than breathing. And yet, for all that, there was something in the quality of his attention during these late evening hours that set them apart from the rest of the day. During the morning and early afternoon, when the light from the window was at its strongest and the sounds of Fleet Street were at their loudest, his work had a brisk, business-like character. He would tackle the broader elements of a design, the framework lines and the bolder strokes, with an efficient purposefulness. But as the light faded and the street grew quiet and the fire settled into its evening rhythm, his pace would slow, and his attention would narrow until it encompassed nothing beyond the small circle of lamplight upon the bench, the plate upon its cushion, and the point where the Burin met the copper. In these hours, the distinction between the man and his work seemed to thin, as if the concentration required to cut each line had the effect of dissolving everything that was not essential to the task, leaving only the hand, the tool, and the metal. He was in that state now, working on the penultimate leaf of the lower border. The Burin moved with a steady, unhurried fluency, the line emerging behind it as cleanly as a wake behind a slow-moving boat. The copper yielded to the blade with its characteristic softness, the tiny curl of displaced metal rising and falling away with each stroke. His breathing had settled into a slow, even rhythm that matched the pace of his cutting, and his eyes, focused through the magnifying glass upon an area of copper no larger than a sixpence, saw nothing else. The room around him, the fire, the clock, the rain, the shelves of plates and tools, all of it existed at the very periphery of his awareness, present but unattended, like the furniture of a dream. The leaf took shape beneath the Burin. Its central vein ran in a gentle S-curve from stem to tip, and from this main line, the subsidiary veins branched outward in pairs, each pair slightly shorter than the one below it, so that the overall form tapered naturally toward the leaf's apex. The spaces between the veins he filled with his characteristic hatching, lines so fine and so closely spaced that they would read, in the finished print, not as individual marks, but as a smooth, continuous tone. Where the leaf overlapped its neighbor, he adjusted the depth and spacing of the hatching to create a subtle distinction between the two surfaces, a technique that required him to hold in his mind a clear picture of the finished print, even as he worked upon the reversed image of the plate. This was one of the peculiarities of the engraver's craft that most people found difficult to grasp. Because the printing process involved pressing a sheet of dampened paper against the inked plate, the resulting image was a mirror of the engraved design. This meant that every element had to be cut in reverse, so that the lettering of the ex libris inscription, for instance, read from right to left upon the plate, and would only appear correctly when transferred to paper. For Arthur, this reversal was so habitual that he scarcely thought of it. He saw the plate and the print simultaneously, the one overlaid upon the other in his mind, and his hand worked with equal ease in either direction. He completed the vein structure of the leaf and began the hatching. This was the most repetitive phase of the work, and also in some ways the most soothing. The Burin moved back and forth in short, evenly spaced strokes, each one parallel to the last, building up the tonal area line by line. The sound it made was barely audible, a faint, rhythmic scratching that was felt as much through the fingertips as heard by the ear. It was a sound that Arthur associated with the deepest levels of his concentration, a sound that had accompanied him through thousands of hours of work over 30 years, and that had become, without his ever noticing the transition, one of the most familiar and comforting sounds in his world. Outside, the rain had neither strengthened nor weakened. It continued to fall with the same gentle, measured persistence with which it had begun, tapping against the glass in a pattern that was random in its details, but constant in its overall character, like the sound of a stream flowing over pebbles. The gas lamp in the street cast its amber glow through the wet pane, and the running water on the glass broke this light into soft, shifting fragments that moved across the drawn curtain in slow, silent procession. Had Arthur looked up from his work, which he did not, he would have seen these shapes of light moving across the bays like small, luminous creatures making their unhurried way across a green meadow. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady accounting of the minutes. It was a timepiece of no particular distinction, purchased by Arthur's father from a clockmaker on the Strand some 40 years earlier, and it had occupied the same spot above the fireplace for the entirety of its working life. Its tick was neither loud nor soft, but of that perfectly calibrated middle volume that allows it to be heard when one listens for it, and ignored when one does not. Arthur had a long and untroubled relationship with this clock. He did not watch it, as an impatient man might, willing the hands to move faster or slower. He simply let it keep its count, and when its measured chime sounded the hours and half-hours, he noted the time with a glance that was more a matter of habit than of necessity, for he could generally tell the hour within a few minutes by the state of the fire, the quality of the light, and the progress of his work. The fresh coal had caught fully now, and the fire was burning with a renewed warmth that reached across the room to where Arthur sat. The flames were low and blue at the base of the coals, flickering into brief tongues of yellow at their tips before subsiding. The sound of the fire was a faint, continuous crackling, punctuated at intervals by the soft clinking of one coal settling against another as the lower pieces burned away and those above them shifted to fill the gaps. It was a sound of such unassuming ordinariness that it could easily pass unnoticed, and yet it was fundamental to the character of the room, as much a part of its atmosphere as the smell of ink and copper that lingered permanently in the air. Arthur set down the Burin and reached for the scraper. He had completed the hatching of the leaf and now needed to clean the incised lines, removing the tiny ridges of copper that the Burin had thrown up along their edges. The scraper, a flat-bladed tool with a handle of turned walnut, was held at a low angle to the plate and drawn lightly across the engraved area. It made a soft, whispering sound as it passed over the copper, and the minuscule burrs of metal fell away, leaving the lines clean-edged and ready for ink. He then took the folded muslin and wiped the plate once more, a gesture that was as much about ritual as about necessity. The cloth passed over the surface in slow, careful circles, removing any remaining particles and leaving the copper with a faint sheen. Through the magnifying glass, the completed section of the border appeared as a network of fine dark lines against the brighter metal, each line casting its own tiny shadow under the angled lamplight, so that the engraved design seemed to float slightly above the surface of the plate, possessing a depth and dimensionality that the finished print, for all its beauty, could never quite replicate. He straightened on his stool and allowed his gaze to drift from the plate for the first time in some while. The room received him back gradually, as a pool of water receives a stone dropped gently into its center. First the bench, then the lamp, then the fire, and finally the walls and the curtained window and the shelves of copper plates standing upright in their felt-lined slots. Everything was as it had been. Nothing had changed. The clock showed 10 minutes to 7, and the rain was still falling, and the fire was burning, and the room was warm and quiet and undisturbed. He rose from his stool, slowly, letting his back uncurl from its working posture by degrees. He placed both hands flat upon the bench and leaned forward slightly, stretching the muscles of his lower back, and then he straightened and rolled his shoulders in a slow circle, first forward and then backward, feeling the stiffness ease. His fingers he flexed again, spreading them wide and then curling them. And as he did so, he became aware of the faint residue of copper on his skin, a metallic scent that had long since ceased to be noticeable to him during working hours, but that announced itself afresh whenever he paused and stepped back from the bench. He crossed to the cabinet beneath the framed prints and opened one of its lower drawers. Inside, neatly folded, were the squares of soft cloth in which he wrapped his finished and near-finished plates for storage. He selected one of these, a piece of undyed flannel about 18 inches square, and carried it back to the bench. Carefully, with both hands, he lifted the bookplate from the sandbag and held it up to the lamp, tilting it at various angles to examine the full design one final time before putting it away for the evening. The copper caught the light and returned it warmly, and the engraved lines appeared and disappeared as the angle changed, now dark against the bright metal, now barely visible, now standing out in sharp relief as the light caught their edges. The design was very nearly complete. Only 3 or 4 leaves in the lower right corner remained to be finished, and the final task, the engraving of a thin border line around the entire composition, would take no more than an hour of careful work. Another 2 evenings, perhaps 3 if he was unhurried, and the plate would be ready for its first proof. He laid the plate upon the flannel cloth and folded the fabric over it, first one side, then the other, then the top and the bottom, so that the copper was entirely enclosed in a soft protective wrapper. He placed the wrapped plate in its designated slot on the shelf, sliding it in gently until it rested securely against the felt strip that separated it from its neighbors. The slot was marked with a small paper label, upon which was written in Arthur's neat, upright hand the commission number and the client's name. There were perhaps 40 such slots on the shelves, and roughly half of them were occupied, some by plates awaiting completion, others by plates that had been finished and proofed and were awaiting collection, and a few by older plates that were kept in the studio as references or as examples of particular techniques that Arthur wished to have at hand. With the plate put away, he turned his attention to the tools. This was a ritual that he performed every evening, regardless of how tired he was or how late the hour. It was one that he carried out with the same unhurried precision that he brought to the engraving itself. First, the Burins. He lifted each one from its slot in the tray and examined its cutting face under the lamp, looking for any dulling or chipping of the edge that would need to be addressed before the next session. Tonight, all 6 were in good order. The finest Burin, the one he had used most heavily during the evening, showed a very slight rounding of its point, but this was within the normal range of wear and would be corrected in the morning with a few passes on the oilstone. He returned each Burin to its place in the tray and set the tray on the shelf beside the ink pot. The scraper he examined in the same way, running his thumb lightly along its blade to check for burrs or roughness. Satisfied, he wiped it with a corner of the muslin and placed it in the narrow drawer at the front of the bench where the scrapers and burnishers were kept. The magnifying glass he swung aside on its brass arm, positioning it out of the way of the bench surface, and wiped its lens with a clean corner of the muslin before tightening the knurled nut that held it in place. The muslin cloth itself, now bearing the faint traces of copper dust and ink from the evening's work, he folded carefully and placed in a small basket beside the bench, where used cloths were collected until there were enough to warrant washing. A fresh cloth will be laid out in the morning. The ink pot he sealed by pressing its lid firmly into place, ensuring that the ink would not dry out overnight. The oilstone he returned to its tin box and closed the lid. Each of these actions was performed with a quiet deliberation that was neither hurried nor lingering. They were the natural closing gestures of a day's work, as instinctive and as orderly as the opening gestures had been that afternoon when he had uncovered the bench, laid out his tools, and settled himself upon the stool. The bench, when he was finished, was clear and clean, its surface wiped down with a damp cloth, the grain of the oak dark and gleaming in the lamplight. The tools were in their places, the plate was on its shelf, and the only evidence of the evening's work was the faint scent of copper and ink that hung in the air and the small collection of metal curlings in the basket by the leg of the bench, each one a tiny record of a line that now existed upon the plate, but would not be visible to the world until the day the first proof was pulled. Arthur took a square of heavy canvas from the cabinet and draped it over the workbench, covering the surface completely. This was not merely a precaution against dust, but a signal, a way of marking the boundary between working hours and the time that followed them. With the bench covered, the studio shifted subtly in character, becoming less a workplace and more a room in which a man might sit and be still and attend to nothing in particular. He moved to the fire and stood before it once more, warming his hands. The coals were glowing steadily now, the fresh ones he had added earlier having burned down to join the older embers in a uniform bed of orange heat. The flames had subsided to a low, barely visible flickering, and the warmth that the fire gave off was deep and even, the kind that sinks into the bones and loosens the tension that accumulates in the body over a long day of close work. Arthur held his hands out toward it, palms open, and let the heat do its work. The rain outside had settled into what promised to be a long, quiet event. There was no wind to speak of, and so the rain fell straight down, tapping on the window with a regularity that was almost metronomic. The sound of it filled the spaces between the other sounds of the room, the clock, the fire, the settling of the building, and created a continuous, gentle background that was as effective as silence in smoothing the edges of thought. From the street came a distant sound that Arthur recognized without needing to identify it. The lamplighter, making his evening round. The sound was the faint, rhythmic tap of the lamplighter's pole against the crossbar of a lamppost, followed by the barely audible hiss of gas being adjusted, and then the soft pop as the mantle caught and began to glow. The sound moved along the street, growing fainter as the lamplighter progressed toward Fleet Street, each lamp adding its small contribution to the illumination of the wet pavement. In a few minutes the sound had passed beyond hearing, and the street outside was quiet again, save for the rain and the occasional distant rumble of a cab. Arthur turned from the fire and glanced around the studio with the eye of a man, confirming that all is in order. The shelves were tidy. The bench was covered. The tools were put away. The fire was safe and banked for the night, requiring no further attention. The gas lamp on its brass arm still burned above the bench, but he would extinguish that shortly. For now, its light served to illuminate the room in its evening aspect, casting gentle shadows among the framed prints on the wall and picking out the gilt lettering on the spines of the few reference volumes that stood on a small shelf near the cabinet. These were books on the history of engraving and the principles of decorative design, their pages thick with plates and illustrations, and they have been Arthur's companions since his apprenticeship days, consulted so often that certain pages fell open of their own accord to the most frequently studied examples. He did not take one down tonight. Instead, he returned to the stool beside the bench, though he sat now with his back to the covered work surface, facing the fire. The stool was high enough that his feet rested on the lower rung, and he settled into a posture that was upright but relaxed, his hands resting upon his knees, his eyes on the glowing coals. This was often how he spent the last quarter of an hour before leaving the studio for his rooms, which were situated on the floor above, reached by a narrow staircase at the back of the building. It was a time of transition, a gradual release of the attention that his work demanded, a period during which the concentrated focus of the bench slowly opened out into the broader, less directed awareness of the hours that followed. The fire held his gaze without demanding anything of it. The coals shifted and settled with their quiet, intermittent sounds, and the patterns of light upon their surfaces changed constantly, though so gradually that the eye registered the change only as a general sense of slow, luminous motion. There were colors in the embers that had no names, shades that existed on the boundary between orange and red and gold, and that deepened toward the center of the fire into a darkness that was not the absence of light, but its most concentrated form. Arthur watched these colors with the same unhurried attention that he brought to his work, though without the purpose that directed his attention at the bench. Here there was nothing to examine, nothing to assess, nothing to correct. There was only the fire and the warmth and the quiet company of the room. The clock chimed the half hour. 7:30. The rain persisted. Somewhere in the building, a timber creaked, the old wood responding to the damp and the slight change in temperature that the evening brought. It was a sound so familiar to Arthur that it had long since become part of the silence rather than an interruption of it, as much a feature of the studio's character as the smell of copper or the feel of the worn oak beneath his hands. He let his thoughts settle, the way sediment settles in a glass of water that has been set down after stirring. The concerns of the day, such as they were, drifted to the bottom of his mind and lay there quietly. Tomorrow he would return to the plate and complete the remaining leaves. The day after, or perhaps the day after that, he would engrave the final borderline. Then there would be the first proof to pull, a careful process involving the inking of the plate, the wiping away of excess, and the slow, measured pressing of dampened paper against the copper under the weight of the small hand press that stood in the corner of the studio, covered now with its own canvas drape. The proof would reveal any imperfections that the magnifying glass had missed, and if corrections were needed, they would be made with the burnisher, a smooth-pointed tool used to press down the copper around an errant line, closing it partially or completely so that it would not hold ink. But all of that was for tomorrow and the days beyond. This evening's work was done, and the thought of it rested easily in his mind, neither pressing nor incomplete. The plate was progressing well, and he was satisfied with it, and that was enough. He rose from his stool a final time and crossed to the gas lamp. He reached up and turned the small brass tap at its base, and the flame within the frosted glass mantle diminished gradually, the hiss of the gas falling to a whisper, and then the light went out, leaving only the soft glow of the fire to illuminate the room. The studio settled into a deeper quietness, the shadows in its corners deepening, the shapes of the shelves and the covered bench and the framed prints becoming softer, less defined, as if the room itself were preparing for sleep. Arthur stood for a moment in the firelit dimness, letting his eyes adjust. The rain tapped gently at the window. The clock ticked on. The fire breathed its slow, steady warmth into the room. Everything was still, and everything was in its place, and the small studio near Fleet Street held within its four walls a quietness so deep and so complete that it seemed less like the absence of activity than like a kind of presence, a thing in itself, as real and as tangible as the copper plates upon the shelves and the Burins in their tray and the faint, lingering scent of ink that had settled into the very fabric of the room. He moved toward the door that led to the narrow staircase and his rooms above. His hand found the latch in the familiar darkness, and he paused there for a moment, as he always did, looking back into the studio. The firelight picked out the edge of the mantelpiece and the white face of the clock and the dull gleam of the brass lamp arm, and on the shelf nearest the door, the cloth-wrapped edge of the bookplate he had been working on all evening. Everything was quiet and warm and waiting, the room holding itself in readiness for the morning, when the curtain would be drawn back and the lamp lit and the bench uncovered and the tools laid out and the day's work begun again. He closed the doors softly behind him and climbed the stairs, his footsteps quiet on the bare treads. Below, in the studio, the fire continued to glow, and the clock continued to tick, and the rain continued to fall against the window, and the room settled into the long, undisturbed peace of the night. If you've stayed with us this far, if your breathing has slowed and the world around you has softened and drifted away, then you're very welcome here. Thank you for listening tonight. It was a gentle pleasure to share this quiet hour with you. If you enjoyed this story, you might consider joining our small community on Override. Subscription is free and means a lot. And if you'd like to leave a word in the comments, even a quiet word, we'd be happy to find it there in the morning. Wherever you are, sleep well. The rain is still falling. The fire is still warm. And the room will hold its peace until you're ready to return. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.